Thank you for joining us for our webinar on bringing your network outdoors. Today, we're going to talk about why there is a need, but also go over the best ways to implement your outdoor solutions. My name is Gary Bebo. I've been the Director of Sales for OptiView since 2001 and the Director of Sales for ArmorLogix since 2013. Over the last 20 years, I've had the joy of being able to work with thousands of customers, bringing their projects to life with end-to-end solutions in the integration and CCTV industries. ArmorLogix came to life because OptiView saw a need to bring a higher quality, longer-lasting weatherproof enclosure to our surveillance solutions. This need rapidly expanded to protecting all kinds of network infrastructure and grew ArmorLogix into a 25,000 square foot facility where we operate in today. So why would you need to bring your network outdoors? Simply put, people are demanding it. Today, more than ever, people expect to be connected and want the ability to access their equipment remotely. The IoT and connectivity is growing faster than ever in recent years. During COVID, we saw many businesses expand their business past their physical walls and need connectivity beyond for point of sale, digital menus, and keeping an eye on things when they were not there or shut down for extended periods. In addition, we saw a huge spike in theft and trespassing as people knew these sites were likely shut down. We saw the need for network connectivity for surveillance cameras, remote video viewing, sensor equipment, and remote guard services. Where do we see an increase in outdoor network connectivity? We see it in schools who are expanding their network past their walls for security and perimeter detection. We also see schools expanding for AV needs and Wi-Fi connectivity out to their perimeter, their baseball fields, and of course their stadiums on campus. We also see it in marinas who utilize surveillance cameras and access control over very large acreage lots. In construction sites for remote guard and time management projects, and we see it in the oil and gas industry for connectivity and data transmission of equipment on site. One of the most unique fields that we're in is agriculture, where sensors are being used to instantaneously send data back for real-time site management. We're not just limited to those areas though. One of the largest areas that we've expanded into now is property management, being single site and multi-site management. Now that we know how popular it is, how do we do it the right way? Bringing your network outdoors correctly starts with fully understanding the demands of each job. Let's take a look at the questions that you need to answer in order to understand the complete job scope and requirements. What are the specific job requirements? This allows us to ask, what are you trying to connect to outdoors? What are the technical requirements of the job? And what equipment do you need to fulfill those requirements? What are the physical locations and environments that the equipment's going to be mounted in? What temperature ranges do you need to factor for? What kind of protection will your equipment need from the weather? What kind of data and power do you have access to? Will you have a hardwire for data, or do you need to consider wireless? Will you have local power, or will you require auxiliary power such as solar? What is the distance from your installation to existing infrastructure? Where is the equipment being installed, and are you mounting it to a wall, a pole, or maybe a sub-building? How heavy is your completed solution? This includes the weight of the enclosure and the weight of the equipment inside. Are there environmental factors making for a more challenging installation, such as standing water, irrigation heads, or direct sunlight? What is your total cost of ownership for this project? How are you supporting this equipment in the future? Is that your responsibility or the customer's responsibility? And will you be signing a maintenance agreement that requires ongoing service? Now that you have all of the project details and it's time to bring your network outdoors, it's time to bring it all together and design your solution. This all starts with your enclosure. Factors that you need to consider are the enclosure size, how you are mounting equipment inside the enclosure, the enclosure material, its weatherproof ratings, and any other additional features you may need. Enclosure size is one of the most important decisions you make. Choosing the right size is crucial not only for fitting all of the desired equipment, but also for serviceability and internal equipment longevity. When designing the inside of your enclosure, you have to think in 3D. Many of you might be used to working with flat surfaces like a wall or have a lot of space that you could play with. With an enclosure, though, you are confined to a specific space with no room for forgiveness. If you select an enclosure that's too small, your equipment may not fit and you may cause overheating, while picking an enclosure too big may be too costly or may limit where it can be mounted. Remember, you need more space than just for the equipment itself. You need to factor on cable management, power supplies, power cords, antennas, and if you want room for expandability on the job site. Unfortunately, it's easy to overfill an enclosure. We'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. Remember, size matters, and it's important to think in 3D space. Ask yourself these questions. What equipment are you using inside the enclosure? Do you have enough airflow for the equipment? Did you include enough space for cable management? Did you include enough space for termination to the equipment? And do you have enough space to upgrade when your customers' need increase? For example, upgrading from a 4-port to an 8-port network switch, or maybe an 8-port to a 16-port rack-mounted switch. It's easy to lay out if you plan ahead. Here on this slide, we show what happens if you don't have a plan or if you use an enclosure that's too small. Overcrowded installations can cause equipment failures and waste expensive tech time on the job site. Selecting the right enclosure size and properly mounting equipment using DIN rail or standoffs will save you time on the job in the future. What are some of the different ways to install equipment inside your enclosure? One way is to mount equipment directly to the enclosure backplate. That is, if your enclosure provided an included backplate. This can be done by directly mounting hardware or by using spacers providing extra airflow. This is an adjustable and removable plate allowing for easy equipment mounting inside the enclosure or even mounting equipment outside the enclosure and simply installing the backplate with all of the equipment ready to go. Another way to install equipment inside the enclosure would be to use DIN rail onto the backplate, allowing for flexibility on the install and also offering quicker service time if a piece of equipment fails. The other way to mount your equipment is with unistrut, shelving, or racks installed directly inside the enclosure. Unistrut is a mounting option similar to DIN rail, but is heavier duty and would have its own options for accessories. Many of these accessories can be picked up from your local supply house or hardware stores. Another popular thing we see being installed are server racks or equipment shelves right inside the enclosure. This gives you tons of freedom on site, and as many of you know, would fit your standard rack-mounted devices such as network switches. Now that we've talked about mounting inside the enclosure, let's talk about enclosure material. Many of you may already use plastic or fiberglass enclosures, so let's start there. Some of the pros of plastic enclosures are that they are inexpensive and lightweight. They are naturally electrically insulated, but some of the downsides of plastic is that they are not for use long-term outdoors, and these materials may break down or become brittle over time. They also have limited chemical resistance and are extremely easy to damage or vandalize. Similarly to plastic, fiberglass is inexpensive and offer a wider temperature range than plastic and does not rust or corrode. However, they are easy to damage and easy to fracture, and we've seen them warp when in direct sunlight. Next up, we have steel enclosures, which are commonly used outdoors. So what are the pros of steel? They are naturally fire resistant, they have durable construction, and they do not swell or deform in the sunlight. Steel is also naturally RFI shielded and is one of the hardest metals. Similarly to plastic, fiberglass is inexpensive and offer a wider temperature range than plastic and does not rust or corrode. However, they are easy to damage and easy to fracture, and we've seen them warp when in direct sunlight. Next up, we have steel enclosures, which are commonly used outdoors. So what are the pros of steel? They are naturally fire resistant, they have durable construction, and they do not swell or deform in the sunlight. Steel is also naturally RFI shielded and is one of the hardest metals. However, as popular as steel is, your costs can add up as enclosures can rust or begin to break down, or you may find yourself having to apply ceramic coatings or paint them to keep them cooler. Steel enclosures need to have additional thermal protection, as steel has difficulties dissipating heat without additional coatings on the exterior. Now let's talk about aluminum. While heavier than plastic, aluminum enclosures are lighter than steel enclosures. Despite being more expensive than the cheapest plastic or fiberglass enclosures, aluminum grants significant quality for the price. Aluminum has the ability to withstand high temperatures and dissipates heat extremely well. Its durable construction is lighter than steel, and while being completely non-corrosive and non-rusting. Aluminum is naturally RFI shielded and fire resistant, and when exposed to direct sunlight does not swell or deform like plastics or fiberglass. More than a decade ago, OptiView used plastic, fiberglass, and steel enclosures. However, we needed a higher quality enclosure that was better designed to withstand the ruggedness of the environment. We were tired of enclosures warping and shattering, frying the equipment within. We were done with enclosures rusting through and falling off their mounts. That's why ArmorLogix was born. Its mission to design and engineer high-quality aluminum enclosures to stand the test of time. Pictured here is our 27-inch NEMA 3 enclosure. This enclosure has been outdoors in the harsh Florida environment for almost 4 years. Not only has the external of the enclosure stood up to the environmental abuse, but the internal equipment as well. Now that you've picked material and the size enclosure you need to determine the weatherproof rating that you require. As you can see here, there are dozens of NEMA ratings to choose from, with even more variations for each. NEMA 3 and NEMA 4 are the most commonly used and specified in the low voltage field, be it for indoor or outdoor installations. NEMA 3 is weather resistant and protects against falling dirt and wind-blown dust, rain, sleet, snow, and ice. NEMA 4 is weather tight and provides additional protection against water sprayed directly at the enclosure. Additional variations such as X, RX, S, P, and K provide additional protection for your specific conditions. For example, NEMA 3R or NEMA 4X. Here, you can quickly spot the difference between a NEMA 3 and NEMA 4 enclosure just by seeing the vent on the door or on the sides. On the left, you can see NEMA 3, which is vented on the sides, pulling in cool air and then vents the hotter air out the front door. On the right, you see a NEMA 4, which has no vents, providing complete weather-tight protection. Now that you've chosen which weatherproof rating is right for you, there are a few additional features you need to consider when finalizing your enclosure. Each of these may add cost to your enclosure, but provide essential features pertinent for your specific job. A sunshade to protect against direct sunlight, helping reduce internal temperatures. Locks to secure access to your enclosure and your equipment inside. Vents and screens to provide protection from insects and other nuisances from getting inside the enclosure. 90-degree versus 180-degree hinges to enable easier access or serviceability in the future. Insulation to better control the internal temperature of the enclosure, and of course, consider fans, thermostats, heaters, and other powered accessories to help perform better out in the field. What you require is all based on the questions we answer in the beginning, like the equipment, the physical location, or the job requirements. Now that you have your equipment protected, now we need to get your data in and out. There are a few different ways to do this, so let's talk about different ways of bringing data in. Cat6. Cat6 wire has a max distance of 328 feet from the building or your data source into the enclosure. Fiber goes a much longer distance at a max distance of 24 miles from building or data source to your enclosure. A wireless bridge allows, of course, for wireless connectivity from your data source to your enclosure, but you may require line of sight. If your site requires wireless but you do not have line of sight, you can consider cellular. The cellular option allows you to utilize networks like AT&T, Verizon, or maybe a provider of your choice to get to the most remote areas. Here we can see multiple weatherproof connectors allowing you to bring cables inside the enclosure. Across the top, we have weatherproof glands, and on the bottom, we have several options for liquid-tight flexible conduit that offers better protection to your cabling coming into the enclosure. We also see the 45-degree gland being popular on some of our most recent projects. For those of you who need to bring wireless or cellular into a metallic enclosure, such as aluminum or steel enclosures, it's important to remember that your antennas must be external, which is where you would need the bulkhead connectors being used, pictured on this slide. Now we need to get your solution mounted on the job site. Unfortunately, it's not always as simple as bolt it to the wall or hang it on a pole. There are multiple factors you need to consider to ensure your solution remains safe and secure for the future. The weight of the enclosure plus the equipment can determine how it's mounted for the location. Heavier enclosures may require the use of unistrut or may need heavier duty poles to safely support the load. Objects in your environment, such as sprinklers, gates, or other equipment, may affect how high or where you mount the enclosure. Be aware of your surroundings. Mounting higher off the ground prevents standing water from getting in and also prevents people from gaining easier access to your equipment, while mounting too high may make it too difficult to service the equipment in the future. Let's take a look at some of our installers' work and see how they have mounted ArmorLogix enclosures. On the picture there at the far left is an ArmorLogix 16 by 16 by 10 enclosure that's housing the network source that goes back to the main facility building. Further up that pole, you could see that we're bringing in an Axis PTZ camera that's connected to the ArmorLogix enclosure. Being located here in Florida, we do a lot of waterway security. So in the second top image, you could see security cameras mounted directly to an ArmorLogix enclosure. And immediately underneath that enclosure in that image, you could see the top of a wireless access point. That access point is taking all of the camera data and sending it back to the homeowner's residence up at the top of the hill. Below that image, we had a site that was dealing with an enormous amount of illegal dumping, and that enclosure houses network and fiber infrastructure that connects back to a larger backbone. The images there in the center are from water treatment plants and cellular connectivity sites, both in which you could see are utilizing unistrut mounting options for the enclosure. There, wrapping up on the far right, is a homeowners association that's utilizing an ArmorLogix enclosure to house camera surveillance gear, and the cameras immediately above the enclosure are reading license plates. What's your total cost of ownership, or how can you protect yourself and your equipment while saving costs in the future? It's imperative to select the enclosure material to properly perform in the environment it's installed in, and to select the right size to properly fit your equipment, wire management, and allow for expansion and serviceability. Mounting equipment inside the enclosure too compacted can cause a whole host of problems that will only cost you more time and labor in the future. Let's take a look at this image on the left. What you see here is somebody who may have only based their install on physical dimensions of the equipment. There was no thought process around the wire management or serviceability. When looking at the enclosure on the right, you could see that our integrator planned out this backplate quite well. Total cost of ownership is a real challenge for most and needs to be taken seriously. Picking the right enclosure with the right accessories with expert planning will protect you and the equipment for the long haul. That's why ArmorLogix enclosures come stock with enclosure sunshade, mylar insulation, equipment mounting plate, universal enclosure mounting brackets that allow you to mount to a wall, pole, or unistrut, the lock, weather-tight seals, and screened or meshed vents at no additional cost. Many of you are more than capable of handling the install of your equipment out in the field, but as we've seen over the recent months, there's a large labor shortage. You can collaborate with ArmorLogix, and we will be your labor arm to have your enclosure ready to deploy when it arrives. This option will also offer you repeatability, as each enclosure will be built to spec and using the same templates, and in many cases, the same customization team will be building your entire project here at ArmorLogix. We want to thank everybody who was able to join us for this webinar event, Bringing Your Network Outdoors. If you'd like to learn more about ArmorLogix, please visit our website at ArmorLogix.com, drop us an email, sales@ArmorLogix.com, or give us a call today to discuss your next project, 904-674-2976. Thanks for joining us.